Here's what some people are saying about the Projection Booth podcast.
The Projection Booth is single-handedly the greatest film podcast you could ever listen to or could possibly want.
Top notch. 5 stars. This has quickly become one of my favorite film-related podcasts. Always interesting.
A completely unpretentious yet fully comprehensive look at films from all genres.
The Projection Booth podcast, with new episodes available every week at projectionboothpodcast.com.
Mouth of Dorkness podcast. Here are Brad and Darren.
Welcome to another edition of the ITMODcast podcast. With me is Brad Gullickson, Mouth Dork.
You lose, Carl Miller.
And I'm your host, Darren Smith, the Disco Dork. And welcome to the ITMODcast podcast, ITMODSpotlight, Bruce Lee. We have so far during our journey with the Dragon chronicled his films, The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, and Way of the Dragon. We have 2 films left. After Way of the Dragon, Bruce Lee would go on to start Game of Death, but then would leave to go commence filming and complete filming of Enter the Dragon, and then come and not finish Game of Death.
So my understanding about Game of Death is that the pagoda scene that climaxes this movie was all shot before Enter the Dragon.
Yes.
And then Warner Brothers came calling and said, look, we have an international sensation here in Bruce Lee. It's time to bring him to Hollywood.
Yes.
And make a real, quote unquote, Hollywood production with Enter the Dragon.
Yes.
And Game of Death was put on hold. They made Enter the Dragon. We'll talk about that film next week.
Yes.
And then Bruce Lee brought his focus back to Game of Death. He was going to finish it. Unfortunately, he passed away.
Yeah.
And the result was
Robert Klaus, the director of Enter the Dragon, who Bruce Lee had just worked with and completed filming with, decided to take Bruce Lee's notes and the footage that he had used and complete Game of Death himself.
So before we talk about Game of Death, the film that is today, what was Game of Death, the film, supposed to be? It directed by Bruce Lee.
Yes.
It was like Way of the Dragon, his vision, his idea. He shot 100 minutes worth of footage. Now, that 100 minutes worth of footage is probably actually just 20 some odd minutes of usable footage because it's a lot of outtakes and alternative takes.
Right.
So, but what was the original intent of this film?
So, as mentioned before, I'm pretty sure I've mentioned before on the podcast, Bruce Lee was never an adopter to an exclusive way of thinking. He was never of the mind that one style of martial art is better than the other. Again, he saw benefit in everything. He saw, and I don't just mean in benefit in everything in regards to like martial arts style, but I mean in life in general, benefit into the way someone from a different culture thinks and perceives things, and the way someone from another culture lives their life. He saw benefit in all of these things. He saw beauty in all things, and martial art was no different. So what he wanted to do and what he did in his films, so we just saw Way of the Dragon. So there's several scenes in Way of the Dragon where the merits of Chinese boxing is brought up versus kung fu, and the difference
in Japanese karate,
and the difference in styles and the rigidity of karate compared to the looseness and fluidness of kung fu. And while Bruce Lee was never a proponent of saying Chinese Kung Fu is better than karate, he was always of the mind that it is not inferior to karate. No one martial art is better than the next. If you are a master in any one thing, you can, you can use that, to its highest potential.
So my understanding is in, the late 60s when Bruce Lee came to the States and he wanted to show that Chinese martial arts had value in a country that, in America, karate was like taking off, right? And, GIs had gone over to Korea during the Korean War, and they'd picked up this art form and they brought it back to the States, and we were starting to do karate tournaments in the States. And Chinese Kung Fu was not widely known, certainly not accepted. And in the early 60s, Bruce Lee wanted to show that this style had merit. But in coming over here, he started to develop his own style, what we've talked about on this podcast, where he started to adapt other techniques from a variety of martial arts. And he created
Jeet Kune Do.
Right, the art of the intercepting...
The way of the intercepting fist.
The way of the intercepting fist. But then, by the time, he had 3 schools in the States, he closed those schools down, and he wanted to pursue martial arts through self, right? He could only teach so much, and he really wanted to go interior. And then he thought, if I could go to Hollywood and make movies, I could bring this philosophy of the physical art form of martial arts to the rest of the world. Hollywood being what Hollywood was, there wasn't a lot of acceptance for him, so he went back to China, and that's when he made The Big Boss and what have you.
Right. We have to mention one of the reasons why karate and taekwondo were the martial arts that were first known to Western civilization as opposed to kung fu and martial arts from China is because Chinese culture, and especially Shaolin, they forbid the teaching of that outside of China to non-Chinese people. And that was the biggest hurdle that Bruce Lee encountered when coming over here to teach that to us. Not from us. He probably encountered some type of prejudice from American people, but his biggest hurdle was getting the okay from the Chinese to teach Kung Fu to non-Chinese people, to white people, to Americans.
And one of my favorite stories that I've encountered since we've been doing this podcast is when he had his school in San Francisco, he is challenged by another master to a duel, a tournament. And if Bruce Lee had lost that, he would agree not to teach foreigners, white people, the art of Kung Fu.
So, this fight, Bruce Lee used Kung Fu. Didn't use Jeet Kune Do. Jeet Kune Do didn't exist at this point. Because this fight turned out the way it did, Bruce Lee felt it lasted too long. If you see that interview when he does it's his screen test for his part in I believe it was Longstreet. And he's explaining the difference between karate and kung fu. And he says that line where he says, well, the movies would have you believe that you go step 1, step 2, step 3, and then bam, to finish your opponent. But, the most efficient way is I'm not going to do all these flashy and flourishing moves and then deliver my final blow. I'm just going to try to end the fight as soon as possible. So this fight with this school, with this ultimatum, if you win this fight, you can teach to whomever you choose. If you lose this fight, you got to get out. You got to leave. You can't even, not only can you not teach here, but you got to leave. That fight, while he won that fight, he was not satisfied with his performance. He felt it took too long. He felt winded at the end of that fight. And so he went back. He did that thing you said where he went into himself, and that's when he created Jeet Kune Do. He felt that okay, with Chinese Kung Fu and Wing Chun. So Wing Chun is the martial art that Bruce Lee was most proficient in. That's the style that Ip Man taught him. And so he felt like with what he knew, what he was taught, and what he was proficient in, it was not enough when dealing with a real world confrontation, with dealing with someone who is also proficient in a martial art. Because being taught any martial art for self-defense, Wing Chun, Taekwondo, Jeet Kune Do, Shotokan, Budokan, any of those things, if you go out to day-to-day life and you encounter somebody and you have to use that for self-defense, 9 times out of 10, what you know, if you're proficient in that martial arts, will be enough to subdue just someone who is not proficient in martial arts, who's just a random street fighter or whatever. But if you're fighting someone else who is proficient in self-defense, then maybe that style that you use is not going to be enough. And for Bruce Lee, he felt like it wasn't enough. He felt like he exerted too much energy. It took too long to defend himself and to defeat an opponent who was of comparable skill. So that's when he went into himself, went into that super philosophical and scientific mode and broke down the martial arts and looked at different styles and looked at his performance and what he did, not what history is taught, but what he did and what he was taught, and said, well, how could I have done that better? In what way, when he was fighting and when he was throwing his kicks and I was throwing mine, and he was blocking, what way could I take 3 seconds out of that strike or a millisecond out of that strike to connect faster? What way could I defeat this opponent faster? So he remembered everything from that fight and saw countermeasures to it. If you could go and look at his literature, he has diagrams, he's drawing. When you look at Jeet Kune Do and his breakdown and creation of it, he has drawings and diagrams of the movements and the benefits of that movement and how you do it and why you would do it in that way. So through that fight, Jeet Kune Do was born. And that philosophy of taking some of Muhammad Ali's movements from boxing and bouncing around, which you would see later in Way of the Dragon, and taking punching techniques. Because when you look at Bruce Lee in a lot of his films, he throws like a lot of like power haymakers, but he's punching from the waist. And so in karate and Wing Chun, you don't punch from the waist, you punch from the shoulder. So he's taking a lot of boxing philosophies and implementing into his fighting style and self-defense techniques and helping it become something else. So that was his first experience with being challenged in America.
Now, so my understanding, though, is by the time he goes out to pursue his career as an actor and he shut down his schools and he's gone back to Hong Kong to make The Big Boss and Fist of Fury, he's also coming to the realization that he was relying too much even on his own style. And that by the time we get to, Way of the Dragon and Game of Death with Lee as director, he's adapted this motto, and he had the gold medallion that he wore constantly, where you had the yin and yang on one side, and then he had this saying, using no way as way, having no limitation as limitation. That he felt like he was relying so much on this technique, that this style, that it prevented him from adapting to any scenario that came his way. Yep. His daughter Shannon Lee explains that quote as, not to get too caught up or bound by anything. Just persist and find the way that works best, but not limiting yourself.
It will also be reflected in his statement about be water, be formless. Water is formless. You put it in a cup, it becomes the cup. You put it in a pot, it becomes the pot. So water can change shape and adapt to any environment it's placed in. It can splash or it can crash. And so that would also play into the adaptability of oneself.
So now here he is at Game of Death, and he's wearing this yellow tracksuit. And the reason he's wearing this yellow tracksuit is because it has no affiliation to any particular style. And the plot, as I understand it, was there was going to be a tournament, and it was taking place in this temple, this Buddhist temple. And as he went up the temple, he would encounter a different style, and he would have to find a way to counteract that confrontation.
So this setup would predate the first Street Fighter video game, where or the first video game where you would go to each level and you would fight a different fighter. If you look at Street Fighter's roster, Ken has a different style from Guile. Guile has a different style from Balrog. Balrog has a different style from Vega. Vega has a different style from Bison. So you have to adapt your fighting style to fight these different styles. But it's that tier system in fighting games, and that we would see in films later on. But that idea would be the heart of Game of Death. You're right. On the first level, there would be someone who does judo. On the second level, there would be someone who does Budokan. On the third level, there would be someone who does Kempo. Fourth level, Taekwondo, and so on. To show not only the different types of styles, but to show that Bruce Lee has become able to adapt to these different fighting styles.
So when Bruce Lee is pulled away by Warner Brothers to go make Enter the Dragon, what he is filmed are just 3 stages of that fight.
Right.
The final 3 stages.
Yes.
There's a fight with
Don Inosanto.
Yeah, and he has not nunchucks. He gets nunchucks, but he has like those sticks.
Rods, yes. And Don Inosanto would become one of Bruce Lee's first and highest-ranking practitioners of Jeet Kune Do and an instructor, and to this day still teaches. And
Lee confronts him with a bamboo reed, a whip, a bamboo whip, basically. And, it's showing that this piece of nature, this little bamboo whip, can be as mighty as a sword because of its flexibility.
Now, as we talked about before, you mentioned how you were looking for Bruce Lee's philosophies when we were watching The Big Boss and Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon. You were, having listened to the podcast and having become familiar with some of Bruce Lee's philosophies and teachings, you were actively looking to see if those and how those translated to the films. And with this film, or with this footage that wasn't used, one of the things that was different but the same is, yes, there would be Bruce Lee's philosophies, but he would be literally telling and translating his thoughts and philosophies. Talk about that.
Well, the pagoda scene, this 100 minutes, cut down into 30 minutes, this is what I was anticipating from all of the films, based on what I knew of Lee as a philosopher, a warrior poet, right? And it's very much an action sequence as lesson, and I truly dig it. I love it.
So different from anything that you would see outside of this,
and
think about
really anything he had done before this. You don't get this in Way of the Dragon, Fist of Fury, or The Big Boss.
No, I mean, even since then, with action films today, like, you don't see the philosophy explained and the merits of why this is used in the self-defense. It's just vengeance or revenge.
Well, what's interesting about it is, Hong Kong cinema before The Big Boss was very much, a swordplay kind of entertainment. It was very fanciful. And Hong Kong cinema after this, you have still a variety of genre, but the action genre still goes extremely fantastical. Whether it's, a wushu film or a John Woo movie, there's very little reality in action cinema, just like there's very little reality in a Schwarzenegger movie or action cinema that we get today here in the States.
Right.
What Lee was going for was realism, was showing the audience, we're going to take some liberties and we're going to have fun and we're going to do an action movie, but I also want to show that there is like when I throw a punch, it's a punch to knock a dude out. It's to end the fight. Every punch is there to end the fight.
Yep.
And I think that's, yes, it's the philosophy side of that Lee brought to this story, certainly, but it's also the physical side and how he wanted to portray the action as realistically as possible. And in the pagoda scene, as he's going up the levels, he has 2 cohorts with him.
Yes.
The one guy who they kind of have like an antagonistic relationship where, are they on the same side? It's kind of a Liu Kang, Johnny Cage situation, right? Yeah. And then there's a third guy who's kind of like he was meant to be the simpleton character who tagged along, and he gets his ass kicked first. Yeah. And they were going to climb the pagoda together until they reached, the top, and that's where Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was. Right. And when you're watching the pagoda scene just as by itself, what I love is when Lee gets done with the double nunchuck fight, which is epic and amazing, and also seems just absolutely painful and the worst. Yeah. I do not want to get hit with a nunchuck. I've expressed that many times on this spotlight. I don't like it. Looks painful. When he gets to the second level, the guy who's antagonistic with him, he goes to the third, while Lee squares off with the guy in the white robe. Mm-hmm. And I love the shot while Lee's having his fight, and the other guy's gone to the third level. You don't know what's happening up there. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is there, the character of Hakeem. He kicks his partner, his antagonistic partner, down the flight of stairs. You just see him go, boosh. Yeah. So you get this idea like, oh man, when Bruce Lee gets up there, he's going to face like a really terrifying challenge.
First there's the dust coming from the ceiling.
As the big giant feet smash into the boards above. Yeah.
So we have, after the guy with the nunchucks, which that ends in a pretty cool way too, because basically you see at this point, like he's telling that guy, just stay down. Like, come on, man. Don't do this to yourself. That guy doesn't listen. He gets his neck snapped. He goes to the next floor. And this gentleman, I believe, is using judo. He's using a lot of throwing movements and takedowns. So he's using one's own momentum against them and redirecting that.
When they encounter him, he comes out of his bed. Yeah. And there's a close-up of his hand. Like, he's got this claw hand.
Yeah. And so Bruce Lee dispatches that guy, and as you mentioned, we see the gentleman who ran along ahead, and he gets thrown down the stairs.
What's interesting about that second fight, is Lee punches that dude in the balls twice.
Yep. Yeah,
and it's all about there's I think it might be in that Longstreet episode, but there's a television footage or an interview where Lee has this guy in a headlock, and he's like, I'm going to kill you. How do you get out of this fight? You can't move. And he's like, I don't know how. He's like, you bite me. Mm-hmm. He encourages you're going to die. Mm-hmm. So you got to do you got to use whatever weapon you have. And at that moment, you have your teeth and you bite me.
Yep.
And so when I watch Lee punch a guy in the balls, you never see action scenes where, dudes are going for weak points.
No. But again, that's the realism of it. Like, if you're in real life, if you're coming out of a bar, if you're coming out of a movie theater and someone's threatening your life and you end up, God forbid, you end up on the ground and he has you in a chokehold or he's about to pull a gun or whatever, if his nuts are exposed and that's going to get him off of you and get you up to where you can either flee or retaliate or whatever, then that's what you do. That's the realism of it, and that's what Bruce Lee. And when I watched this scene most recently, it made me giggle because watching all of his movies in such close succession for this ITMODSpotlight, like he does that in almost every film. He hits a guy in the nuts.
Yep.
And so, but again, on one hand, it could be looked at as like, oh, that's dirty, that's dishonorable. But Bruce Lee he's fighting for his life. Like, for him, it's life or death. Like, if I don't take you out, you're going to take me out. And if this will get you down,
he should be a one-punch man.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, noticing that this time, I thought about that. It's like, man, Bruce Lee loves to punch you in the nuts.
And he devastates that guy eventually. Yeah, yeah. He does that backbreaker move. Woo.
Yeah. So the only thing I don't like about this version is that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar's his size, that reveal, is given to the other guy instead of Bruce Lee. So you kind of know what Bruce Lee's going up against when he goes up there. Uh-huh. But still, like, when he gets up there, Bruce Lee's reaction to him, like, in awe. But what I love about it is he's in awe, but he's not afraid. Mm-hmm. So he sees his size, he gets used to it, he accepts it, and then he gets in his stance.
Here's the thing, though. When I'm watching this scene, I thought it was forced perspective at first.
No.
I thought, oh, it's like a Lord of the Rings thing, because look how big Kareem is. I know Kareem's huge, but, dude, he's huge.
Yeah.
He's a tree.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's terrifying.
Yeah. And that's what's so awesome about that. But also is what is also awesome about that scene is, you know, Bruce Lee using the size difference as another bit of his philosophy. Like, it doesn't matter how big you are or how little you are or how big your opponent is. You know, if you just master your techniques, if you know a way, if you can find a way, no way as a way, then you will best your opponent. You will best your situation. Size has nothing to do with it. And like I love that. And it's not an easy fight for Bruce Lee, but it is one that he perseveres.
So I watched this scene after having watched the actual film Game of Death.
Okay.
And watching this 3-level fight separate from the atrocity we're about to talk about, it makes it even more heartbreaking that we were never given this movie. Mm-hmm. And, you know, we haven't talked about Enter the Dragon yet. I have not rewatched Enter the Dragon yet. So I'm curious to see if I feel this way after that movie. But that philosophy warrior, that the warrior poet that is in Game of Death, that's everything I want a Bruce Lee movie to be.
Yeah.
And my memory of Enter the Dragon is it's not that. It's still a Warner Brothers movie with John Saxon and Jim Kelly.
Yeah, it's not. That's the tragedy of it. That 30 minutes, that 40 minutes that we have that's cut together, that's roughly cut together, I might add. And that's the thing. Just, you see that 40 minutes of footage, see that 30 minutes of footage, and you think about your takeaway from that and your response to that. Now imagine if Bruce Lee had went back and edited that, because that wasn't even his edit. Those weren't even his choices of shots and takes. So you just imagine, like, if Bruce Lee had his say in his edit, what that would have been. That's the saddest thing to me. Like, that's the closest to true Bruce Lee we would get in regards to depiction of his philosophies.
So Bruce Lee dies.
Yes.
And Warner Brothers, actually, no, it's Golden Harvest, right? They have this footage.
Mm-hmm.
We got to use it. You know, we filmed it. He filmed it. It's his, it's his last statement. Although I got to say, because he made Enter the Dragon, it's not really his last statement.
No.
We have to maybe, quote unquote, do honor to his memory and put this out into the world.
Yeah.
To take that 20 plus minutes and turn it into a movie, you've got to you have to completely fabricate a storyline.
Yeah.
Now they had his notes. They could have done the story he wanted.
Mm-hmm.
They could have taken his notes, his screenplay, and made that movie.
Mm-hmm.
That is not what they did.
Nope.
And the resulting Game of Death is an insane, uncomfortable, unbearable, almost unwatchable, maybe actually unwatchable for one of us dorks, entry in cinema, not just Bruce Lee cinema. And the crazy thing is, this is not my first time watching this. Lisa and I watched this a couple years ago when she cosplayed as, the pagoda Bruce Lee from this film.
But watching it in the context of ITMODSpotlight.
Watching in the context of ITMODSpotlight and now loving Bruce Lee, it was incredibly painful and not fun. not fun at all.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about your this particular watch of the film.
Well, I pressed play, and I'm immediately excited because the opening credits are awesome.
Yeah.
John Barry is doing the score.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like a James Bond film. Mm-hmm. Bruce Lee's title card is insane. There's like these screaming, floating faces of Bruce Lee, and then Bruce Lee's portrait comes into the center of the frame, and it's gorgeous. It's Way of the Dragon image of Bruce Lee with the nunchuck under his arm, and you're just like, yeah, John Barry. And then the credits start to roll over, and like, Chuck Norris, he's back. Look, there's his credit. Oh my God, I can't wait to see Chuck Norris again. I didn't realize Chuck Norris was in this movie.
Yeah.
Colleen Camp is the female lead. I love Colleen Camp. You know her from Clue, the Police Academy films, Die Hard with a Vengeance. She's amazing. Total crush on her from Police Academy 2 as a kid. Love her. She's going to be in this movie? What? That's great. So happy to hear that. Bob Wall, he's back.
Yeah.
He just came off of, I think he's in the last two, right? He's in Way of the Dragon and Fist of Fury.
Yep.
He's the Russian Petrov.
Yep.
So, I'm pretty darn excited. The film opens up, and it's a replay of the final fight of Way of the Dragon. It's Bruce Lee versus Chuck Norris. And I'm like, oh, okay, so this is how they're going to bring Norris back into it. That's interesting. Okay, we're going to watch the final fight. And I wrote this in my notes. I'm looking at it right now. I was like, is Game of Death a direct sequel to Way of the Dragon? Question mark. And then, you see a camera crew recording it. You're like, oh, this is weird and meta. I like that. Oh, so the character of Billy Lowe is going to be basically Bruce Lee acting in a film. And they call cut, and the Way of the Dragon scene ends. And we meet Billy Lowe.
Who is not Bruce Lee.
Not Bruce Lee. It's just another Chinese guy who looks nothing like Bruce Lee.
So jarring.
It's as if we were making the In the Mouth of Darkness podcast. Darren disappeared. Brian, you're taking Darren's role. You're both black. No one will notice. You can be Darren for most of this movie. And we'll just use inserts of Darren when we want close-ups.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
So here's Billy Lowe. He's always wearing sunglasses. He's always cast in shadow. And they'll do inserts of Bruce Lee from other movies that they alter.
Yeah.
To fit the scene of Game of Death.
Yeah.
And this is early on in the movie. And you get the plot is Billy Lowe is this Hong Kong action hero. He's under contract with these shady dudes. Hugh O'Brien from Twins. He's Arnold Schwarzenegger, Danny DeVito's dad in Twins. Yeah. He's the bad guy. He's the muscle for this corporation. He's got a little cane with a knife in it. Ooh, how scary. He's trying to muscle Billy Lowe, not Bruce Lee. He's trying to muscle Billy Lowe into being under contract with him. And he also wants Colleen Camp to join him. But Billy Lowe doesn't like the cut of this dude's jib. Yeah. These are shady mob dudes. He wants nothing to do with them. Yeah. So he's trying to separate himself, and he's trying to get Colleen Camp to join his side rather than these mobsters, because Colleen Camp, she's got this music career. She's a beautiful singer. Pff, not really. So Billy Lowe is encouraging Colleen Camp to get out from these mobsters, and that really pisses the mobsters off. So they're going to try to put the squeeze on Billy Lowe.
Yeah.
And this has to be one of the stupidest, most offensive, and ugly acts of cinematic ignorance I have ever encountered. Billy Lowe in his dressing room, Hugh O'Brien over his shoulder. He's going to threaten him with this knife cane. And there's a dude pretending to be Bruce Lee, but it's not a double. It's a guy wearing a cardboard 2-dimensional Bruce Lee mask. It is so creepy.
Yeah.
And wrong.
Yeah.
And gross.
Yeah.
Super gross.
Yeah.
And you can't believe that some racist dumbass at thought this was appropriate and acceptable.
Yeah. So
he's wearing a 2D cardboard. It's like a cereal box cutout of Bruce Lee's face.
Yeah.
And it's a close-up shot.
Yeah.
It's obvious that he is wearing a cardboard cutout.
Yeah. So, and this is my problem with the film, because this type of thing will happen throughout the rest of the movie until the last act of the film, where we actually get Bruce Lee using the footage that he shot before he went to go film Enter the Dragon. You know, we have, this is not I don't think this is, well, if it was the first time, this definitely wouldn't be the last time that something like this would happen in Hollywood. You know, ironically enough, Brandon Lee would suffer a similar fate when shooting The Crow. But they had way more footage than that was shot for Game of Death when they decided to continue with. You
mean they had more footage for The Crow?
For The Crow, correct. Yeah. And then it was a time where they were able to use special effects techniques that weren't afforded to the production of Game of Death, so that there were a lot of scenes where they were able to mask the fact that that was not Brandon Lee. But in Game of Death, it's done so. Firstly, it's done so distastefully. It's done exploitatively, and it's not. It really feels like It feels like a cash grab. It feels like, well, Bruce Lee just died. So at the height of his popularity, and because he's dead now, people are really going to be clamoring for stuff with him. So let's put this movie out because we're going to make money.
And you can't claim, well, this is what Bruce Lee would have wanted.
No.
Because you ignore what he wanted. You
Exactly.
had his notes. You had his script. You had the pagoda scene, right?
Yep.
You had the other actors with him in that scene. There was a plot there. Mm-hmm. They could have gone and got those actors to do something more akin to what the original concept was. Mm-hmm. You completely ignore it, and you try to shoehorn the pagoda scene into this atrocity.
Yeah. They would do, like when you say they would use scenes from other films, I mean, there would be a reactionary shot with this actor who is not Bruce Lee. He'll be in a scene. So we're looking at his face for the duration of this scene. We're looking at him through multiple, cuts and dialogue or whatever. And then they'll splice in a shot of the real Bruce Lee giving a reaction from another film and then cut back to this guy.
And they'll be wearing different clothes.
Yeah, like what the fuck? Like, why would you do that? They look nothing alike, first of all. But secondly, it's so out of place. You would have been better off letting that actor who is not Bruce Lee do that whole scene. But instead, you're going to plop this random image of Bruce Lee from The Big Boss in here or from Way of the Dragon. What the fuck? Like, the greediness of, again, and it's not new. Like, I've lived so long past this movie that I've lived to see studios just, churn out movies for cash grabs or whatever, whether it be because after an actor has passed away or for whatever reason, like sequels and things like that, to cash in on the popularity of something. But like for this one hits close to home for me and is more personal to me because if you've listened to any of these episodes, like Bruce Lee was a big part of my life, still is. But as my childhood hero, he was my real life Superman. So I really held him in a high regard. And plus, like when you have a favorite actor or whatever, superstar, TV, movie character, like you're biased in some regards. And for me, I was really protective of that. And the fact that they would exploit his death in that way was really hurtful to me. But then as an adult, going back and watching it, especially this rewatch that I attempted for this review right now, this discussion, having watched all of his films in close succession again, and granted, I've seen these films like many times, but never have I gone through and watched all of them back to back to back to back for the specific purpose of talking about them. But doing that and then having these conversations with you and seeing you grow to know and appreciate him more just made my affinity for him grow, because I know even after his death, that thing that he wanted to do, spread the knowledge and the philosophy, it's happening. Like I'm taking part in that. I'm taking part in something that this guy wanted to do. Like, I'm doing that. So then I see this movie. I start to.
I wasn't even alive when he died. Like, so he died. And, now I'm 38 years old and I'm discovering Bruce Lee. And I really do feel like, not only are we having these conversations every week for the last 5 weeks, but I've been listening to the Bruce Lee podcast. I've been reading his book. Mm-hmm. I just finished watching the documentary, The Warrior's Journey. Obsessed isn't the right word, but I am invested in Bruce Lee.
Right.
Like, he is he's an extremely unique individual in cinema, mm-hmm. in movies. Mm-hmm. There's nobody like him.
No one.
I dare you to point to anybody and say that, Bruce Lee's kind of like so-and-so.
Show me. I live for that discussion. Show me someone. Show me, and we're going to have a really long discussion.
So, getting back to Game of Death, the film that we are given.
Yeah.
I don't really care about talking about the plot at all.
No.
Shenanigans happen.
Right.
It's mob shit,
that
Colleen Camp.
Yeah, that don't include the real Bruce Lee.
Billy Lowe. They find a way to climax the movie with bits from the pagoda scene. But even then...
So we get to this part. We get to the pagoda scene. You have watched an hour of this Frankenstein, this atrocity, this abomination of a film. And then the real Bruce Lee comes on screen for more than 2 seconds. How does that feel to you?
Gross. I mean, I keep the words we keep using: atrocity, abomination, gross, creepy, weird, not good. The way the double, because they try a variety of techniques, none of them good, but at least pick one.
Right.
There's the cardboard mask. There's the body double, who's just another Chinese guy with a similar haircut, but not even the haircut doesn't even match up.
No.
They give him glasses. They cast him in shadow. They shoot over his shoulder. They put tons of stuff in the foreground, so he's always being blocked by something. But then sometimes they don't do that, and they just have the double, like, up close.
Yeah.
Not like an extreme close-up, but like a two-shot.
Yeah.
You're like, that's not Bruce Lee. But then they have, like, this plot element that they fabricate. The fact that he's an actor, right? And because we've made Billy Lowe an actor, that means now we can use shots from Way of the Dragon, filming that movie. Mm-hmm. We can recreate the climax of Fist of Fury and his death scene there. Then he is assassinated. This is so bad. He's killed. Mm-hmm. They think they killed him. They've shot him in the face. And Billy Lowe has to go into surgery, and they wrap his head in bandages. And for a chunk of the movie, he's the unknown soldier. He's all bandaged up. He's just a voice behind some Band-Aids. And he takes like a photograph of Bruce Lee, and he draws a beard on Bruce Lee, so that when he's like, well, this is going to be my new disguise. So when I get these bandages off, now I'll have a beard. And so now they're masking the double with the beard, but why didn't you do that beforehand for like the last 40 minutes? But when they think when he's in the hospital and the mob thinks they've killed him and Colleen Camp thinks he's dead, they put in footage of his, like you said, that's his actual funeral.
That's his actual fucking funeral, Brad.
And so you see the actual corpse of Bruce Lee cut into scenes of him recovering in the hospital, and it is heartbreaking. And when you talk about being exploitative, I certainly agree that is happening, but to go so far as to use paparazzi footage of Bruce Lee in his glass casket is despicable.
Knowing that was coming up, So early on, I
didn't remember that at all. That's the thing. When I was watching it this time around, I remembered nothing about Game of Death outside the pagoda scene and the Kareem Abdul-Jabbar sequence.
So early on, I was just getting offended. Like, I was like, you know what? This movie is pissing me off. And I got really upset during this rewatch. Knowing that was coming up, I said, you know what? Fuck this movie. I hate this movie. At that point, I hadn't even gotten to that point. But hearing you talk about it and me remembering it, like, just it generates an emotional response in me that I just don't. That's just not cool, man. That's just not cool. No, that's fucked up, man.
Yes, I can't believe it. Just like when you think that you can't stoop any lower than
the
cardboard mask.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So that happens, right? So we're getting all of this. We're getting the cardboard mask. We're getting the bad angles. We're getting the bold, like, medium shots, and then we're getting the footage spliced in. So then the pagoda scene comes, and this is, for me, this is the only reason why I would rewatch Game of Death, is for this scene. When he comes back in that pagoda scene for the next 30 minutes, we don't cut away from the real Bruce Lee. And for me, like, when he comes in, it's the familiarity. It's almost like how when I was younger and then my dad would come home and I just feel comfort. Like, this is how it should always be. You should always be here, Dad. You should always be with me. Like, Bruce Lee should always be in this film. Not that fucker who had the beard and the bandage and, you know, not the exploitative footage. Like, you need to be alive and real, and when that comes, like, there's a sentimental value to that last act in Game of Death, but then the dream ends. It's weird. It's like when in a movie, when someone's having a fantasy and it's just going the way that they want, and you know, oh shit, this is just a dream. They're gonna wake up, and then they wake up and it's not real. So that scene ends. He beats Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and then we get that fucking double again at the end.
Like, you go from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar fight to body double versus Hugh O'Brien, and it is the worst fight.
Yeah.
It is so badly choreographed.
Yeah.
It's awful.
Yeah.
It's awful. That's interesting to hear you describe, you know, seeing Bruce Lee finally. Because the thing is, like, Game of Death is not a long movie.
Mm-mm. It feels like it, though.
But it feels like the longest movie.
Yes.
And when you finally get to seeing actual new Bruce Lee footage, the yellow tracksuit scene, I like the way they explain how he gets in that tracksuit, that he's like conked out, like that there are these 3 tracksuits worn by these 3 motorcycle dudes.
Yeah.
There's like a green guy, a black guy, and a yellow suit guy. And like, that's the origin of the yellow tracksuit. That doesn't make any sense. That doesn't work at all.
No.
But by the time you get to Bruce Lee in a yellow tracksuit, it's been like, it's like an hour, right?
At least.
It's at least an hour before you actually get a real Bruce Lee movie out of Game of Death.
Yeah.
And for me, I didn't have that reaction.
Yeah.
I could not enjoy it at all.
Yeah.
I was weirded out. I was so frustrated that I just could not enjoy the scene. And, you know, like when the double nunchucks happen, or when the bamboo whip happens, I'm like, oh, that's cool. And it does have some of Bruce Lee's philosophy. Those lines are in that sequence. But I did not enjoy this scene until you pointed me to the bonus features where you can watch this. Again, it's not ideal. It's not how he would have edited it. It was still a work in progress. But it's, when you're watching that pagoda scene that we talked about at the start of the show, it's a radically different movie, you understand. Mm-hmm. It's a movie that I find much more interesting. Mm-hmm. And it has much more of Bruce Lee's philosophy, you know, actual dialogue in that scene. They cut all of that stuff. Like, to me, it's like, why don't you use every, you know, millimeter of footage?
Yeah.
Why cut anything out? Why cut the other 2 dudes out? Why not bring them in? and make that part of the movie beforehand.
If you're bold enough to put a paper mask, you can just have these dudes just walk in. I'm not going to ask any questions at this point. If they just came out of nowhere, if they were never anywhere in the beginning of that film, at this point, after all this shit that you pulled, I wouldn't even give a shit.
and when you watch the pagoda scene by itself, the full deal, there is a progression, a story there. There is a narrative, and it's interesting. And they chop it all up in Game of Death, and it does feel weird. And when they jump back to that body double, it was nauseating.
Yeah. You know what? If I had continued and watched it all the way through this time, even up to that point, I don't doubt that I may not have had the same. I may have had a similar reaction to you again, because it hasn't been what I was saying earlier is watching all of these films in succession and then getting to Game of Death. It put me in it really, not really compartmentalized, but it put into focus why this whole series that we've been doing up to this point, I've got to express and encapsulate why I love Bruce Lee so much. So taking all of that after having recently had a conversation about it and having it be so prevalent in the forefront of my mind, and then going into Game of Death with it, I've never had a watch of Game of Death with that much baggage going into it. So that's why I could only get through 15 minutes, 20 minutes of Game of Death this time, because I've been thinking about our conversation, how you've been converted to, someone who is interested in and his understanding is digging Bruce Lee now. And again, seeing that thing that he wants done after his death being done, people being exposed and people learning more and using that philosophy in their day-to-day lives, the fact that even after his death, what he was doing is still being done, and I had a part in that, that's just everything to me. So then taking that and then going in the Game of Death and seeing this shit happen, like I really had an emotional response to it, and I cut it off. But if I had sat through it somehow and got to that scene at the end where he shows up at the pagoda, I don't know. I don't doubt that I may have had a different reaction than I normally have, because like I said, I've never come into Game of Death with this much baggage before. So I don't know, but it's just one of those things. I talk to people all the time about Bruce Lee and his filmography and things like that, and I've never been shy to tell people, like, I don't like Game of Death. It's not, I don't even, when thinking about, when I go back to rewatch his movies or when I talk about his movies, I skip over that one. I really do. Because it's not his movie.
Here's the thing. Game of Death and that yellow fucking tracksuit is,
ironically,
the most iconic image.
I know what you're going to say.
On this desk, we have a Funko Pop figure. It's Bruce Lee yellow tracksuit.
My Bruce Lee, yeah.
Over there, I have my Bruce Lee action figure yellow tracksuit. Kill Bill, The Bride, yellow tracksuit. It's epically badass. But it comes from a film that should not exist.
That's so crazy to me.
And honestly, I have this Bruce Lee action figure over here.
See, now
I'm retiring that figure.
Yeah.
Because and it's not to do a disservice to what that pagoda scene is. And I do believe that pagoda scene could have resulted in the epitome of or the quintessential Bruce Lee film. What you get in that rise up the staircase, from the big boss to the next big boss to the next big boss. That's the most philosophy of Bruce Lee that we've been given in his films so far, and we'll have to revisit that question after Enter the Dragon. It's been a while since I've watched that movie, but I believe I'm right. And that should be cherished. But like in my house, in my apartment, now that I am like a Bruce Lee fan and I want to put art up, I want to get, that jock painting, Enter the Dragon.
Oh, man.
That Mondo poster. That's the image I want of Bruce Lee in this house. There, in that same style of action figure that I have over there, there is just a shirtless
The Black Pants?
Black Pants Bruce Lee, Enter the Dragon. Yeah. That's the Bruce Lee I want to see on here. Because now when I see the yellow tracksuit, I agree, it looks cool, it's awesome. That scene is awesome. It's painful. Mm-hmm. And like when we sat down, we've been recording for a while. We've recorded a few episodes. Wife Dork and Turtle Dork have left us. Yeah. But when we sat down and I saw your little Funko Pop Game of Death Bruce Lee figure, I was like instantly sad. I was like, oh shit, we got to talk about this.
When I was at home, I cut it off. Like I was in the disco den, and right on the shelf to the left, I got my Incredible Hulk, my Big Trouble in Little China pop figures, and I looked up over there, and I thought about my Bruce Lee one with the yellow tracksuit, and I was like, "Fuck, man, I hate that movie. I don't like that pop figure. No, I got to get my Enter the Dragon one."
Yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah,
yeah, it's weird. It's weird.
So I'm not. So do you think I'm overreacting with my knowing me and up until this point in the discussions that we've had about Bruce Lee and how I profess my love for him and what he means to me and what I take from him in his films. So do you think I'm overreacting? Do you think I'm being too dramatic when I have that response and like I hate this film? Not from a rational standpoint, but from a serious uber Bruce Lee fan. Do you think it's too much?
I'm not going to answer that yet. I'm going to ask you a question instead.
All right.
We go back to 1973. Mm-hmm. Bruce Lee has just died.
Mm-hmm. We
have this pagoda footage.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do with it? We're not Warner Brothers.
Oh, it's just me and you?
Just me and you.
We do what was done with A Warrior's Journey. We put it in footage that brings respect and pays homage to what that pagoda scene. We show everything leading up to the evolution of the person that would create and write and direct and star in that pagoda scene. So that's to give it context.
That's the thing, right? So The Warrior's Journey, the documentary about Bruce Lee, it's not like a birth to death documentary.
No.
It's really about the evolution of Bruce Lee as a martial artist, but also as a philosopher. And it centered around where he was when he made Game of Death, how he got there, what he was thinking when he was at Game of Death, when he went away to Enter the Dragon, when he came back and he died. And the documentary climaxes with the full pagoda scene. That's all we need. That's all we should have.
Absolutely. There should be no Game of Death film. It should be the filmography. It should be The Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon, Enter the Dragon, and this documentary.
I agree.
I think. And so, but I think, with this discussion, we have to acknowledge, we have to watch or talk about Game of Death because, it only serves to highlight the films that would book in that. Because we talk about the weird experience of Big Boss, how nutty that film was, and Bruce Lee wasn't even in the first 40 minutes, and compared to Game of Death, that's a godsend. Like, it's so what he wasn't in the first 40 minutes, but at least when he was there, even if he was hanging in the background, it was the real Bruce Lee. It wasn't some fucker wearing a mask. You look at how brutal and angry Fist of Fury was and how epic those fight scenes were, and you look at the person that was showcased in that film and the raw talent that was budding, that was just waiting to come out into the world and do a film like his idea for the pagoda in Game of Death. When you see that, when you look at Fist of Fury and go, oh man, give this motherfucker a script and the ability to make a movie about, someone climbing the ranks of these different martial arts or whatever. If you look at that, if you look at Fist of Fury and think about what Game of Death could have been, what he had in mind, it would just, you just get so, it's going to become sad. Like, say, what the fuck? Like, what if? The great what if. And then you look at Way of the Dragon. You see him, okay, we give this guy a camera. And while he gets off to a rough start or whatever, you look at Way of the Dragon, and then you compare that to the 40 minutes of footage we did compile of Bruce Lee, and you can see an evolution of a director that is tremendous with just comparing 40 minutes of footage with his first feature director of film.
That's true. I mean, it is what we get in that pagoda sequence is better than anything he did in Way of the Dragon,
right?
From a directing standpoint.
And so, you look at Game of Death, and for me, the only purpose Game of Death serves to me is to reiterate the nature of the business, the monster, the dragon, like Lisa describes, that there is Hollywood, that is that industry that just is all consuming, and it's just about money. It's just greed. This man who really, Bruce Lee was, like you just said, he is much more than a martial arts star. He's much more than an actor. He was a tremendous talent. He was a tremendous human being, soul. He was so smart and insightful. He was way much more than a cash cow. But yet, the studio treated him like he was just a guy that you could slap, make a mask out of and slap on another actor. They saw him, he had no value. He had no value. When you look at Game of Death and the treatment of Bruce Lee and what he stood for, which is evident in the many books that he wrote and the podcasts that people have about him and the conversations people have about him. You look at his value in that way, how he's affected Brad Gullickson's life in these last couple weeks that you've been reintroduced to him, the value in that. And it was reduced to a fucking mask a cardboard mask that you just put on a guy just to crank out a fucking 90-minute movie. You know what I mean? Like, it's just heartbreaking to me.
So do you watch Game of Death ever again?
Here's the thing. If something comes up and I have to introduce someone else to Bruce Lee, I would do that because I for the same reason that I just mentioned about why we watched it this time and spoke about it this time. But in any other context, I could go the rest of my life and never see it again because I have Big Boss, Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon, Enter the Dragon, and A Warrior's Journey. And that footage. I
think the value of Game of Death, and do I ever watch it again? I'm not sure. If I do watch it again, I need some distance.
Yep.
And I'd probably watch it the way I watch Birth of a Nation. As an example of what we can do to each other and to a person.
Yeah.
As a warning. That might sound hyperbolic, but I really feel like there is something, for lack of a better word, special about the heinous nature of this film. Mm-hmm. And I am so glad we did not end the ITMODSpotlight series on Game of Death.
Yeah.
I had obviously we had a feeling that this was not the place to end this series.
Yeah.
But oh man, I did not know how miserable this movie would make me.
I didn't think I was not gonna be able to make it through the film. I didn't think I was gonna. Never did I predict. I knew I was gonna get upset watching it and have some thoughts on it, but I didn't think I was gonna get 15 minutes into it and have to cut it off out of anger. I never had that happen with a film before. I never just this movie just offends me and pisses me off. Fuck this movie. No, I'll sit down and watch a movie and talk about it afterwards. Like, man, that was a really controversial movie. I understand why people. No, for this one, it's just too personal to me, and so I'm glad that we did not end ITMODSpotlight on Game of Death because I probably would have regretted doing this shit. Like, man, we should have did this. Freaking, this is the last one. But fortunately, we have one film left, and that is Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, which to me is his final film because that's the one he's in from start to finish and he got to complete. And I'm excited because this is granted it is a Warner Brothers film, but it is a Hollywood film. And it's a film that he wanted to make in Hollywood. Bruce Lee wanted to get to Hollywood because, well, if you come over to the West and you're in Hollywood, more people who aren't in China, who aren't Chinese, more Americans are going to be exposed to Kung Fu. What is this thing that this guy is doing? What is this martial art that is not karate? What are these philosophical teachings that he's spouting? What is going on about? So more people would be exposed to him. So he was trying to influence people through entertainment and get into people and their lives and introduce Kung Fu through entertainment. And so he managed to do that with Enter the Dragon and complete that film. But it is such a badass film. Like, you know, it opens with some of his philosophy after he has that iconic fight with a skinny Sammo Hung, which is just insane. He's almost as skinny as Bruce Lee, but he's not. He's fat. He's not fat. He's not Sammo Hung fat. But then you have that moment with his student. But then you have, you know, this is his first film in Hollywood film, so they're not gonna give a Chinese man the main leading role. So really, when you watch it, and I've watched it maybe a year or so ago when that anniversary disc came out, and it was weird because watching it this time, I noticed that John Saxon really feels like he's the star of the movie.
And like, what a weird guy to pair with Bruce Lee.
Right. And John Saxon's cool.
Yeah, sure.
But the fact that he feels like the lead of the film, it was really like odd to me. But I know why. You know what I mean?
I'm curious to watch it again, right?
Yeah. Then you get a badass Jim Kelly in it, and he's fun in the fucking movie.
Sure. I mean, I love Enter the Dragon. I've seen Enter the Dragon multiple times. Last time I watched it was when Alamo Drafthouse won Loudon had it on the big screen.
I'm sad I missed that.
And you know, I adore this movie, but I adore this movie not so much as a Bruce Lee film. I adored it as a 70s action film. Mm-hmm. So now I'm coming in with just a like you know, baggage, different perspective, however you want to put it.
Yeah.
Am I going to like it as much as I liked Fist of Fury? Am I going to like it as much as I like the pagoda scene or the potential of the pagoda scene?
And here's the thing. I haven't rewatched it. Again, I haven't rewatched Game of Death within the context of consecutive rewatch of all his films. Well, the same applies to Enter the Dragon. I'd be surprised, but at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if I come out of this going, well, shit, maybe all of a sudden I like Fist of Fury better. Maybe it's my favorite Bruce Lee film. But if that happens for you, I think that it speaks volumes about Bruce Lee. I really do. Especially because of, well, who you are now, who you are watching Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon, watching that film, Brad Gullickson, the film goer, with the knowledge of Bruce Lee that he has, compared to that first episode before we watched Big Boss, when we just did the introduction, and how in that short time span through watching his films, how he was able to connect with you and change your perception of the world and of his films and your appreciation of it. So I think that'd be tremendous if that happens. Even if it doesn't, it's still ending on a high note because Enter the Dragon is infinitely better than fucking Game of Death. Anything is, actually. So I'm excited to rewatch that. So yeah. I can't wait, man. Mr. Han with the freaking razor hands. Like, that's so dope. Jim Kelly, suddenly I like to leave your island. It's one of my favorite scenes. So man, again, thank you so much for helping me get through this episode, B. I didn't think I was gonna make it.
You weren't looking forward to it. I know that much.
I was not. But on the other hand, I was looking forward to your response and perspective on the film, and I was curious as to its impact on you.
What if I came in and I was like, you know what, Game of Death is my favorite Bruce Lee movie?
This episode would have been way different.
ITMODcast over.
Man, it would have been fuck Resident Evil versus Underwear. It would have been Brad versus Dan.
Fisticuffs.
Oh man. But yeah, thank you again for facilitating this conversation as well as the previous conversations. It's bittersweet. Looking forward to the Enter the Dragon episode because we're coming to an end. But I'm glad to be on this warrior's journey with you. So if you enjoy this episode, please follow the podcast at ITMODcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Share some comments or thoughts on social media with us. We would be more than happy to talk Bruce Lee with you. And you can follow the podcast on follow Brian William Young at the Turtle Dork on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. He's at the Turtle Dork 1 on Instagram. Wife Dork is at Sidewalk Siren on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. And Brad Gullickson is at Mouth Dork on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and Letterboxd. I'm Darren Smith, the Disco Dork, on all social medias. Be on the lookout. Brad Gullickson is hosting Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid at the Alamo Drafthouse in Winchester on the 21st at 5 p.m. Tickets are on sale.
$7.
Not bad. Come out. He's going to host that. He's going to give you a little bit of insight into why he chose that film. And then we're going to watch that film. And then afterwards, we'll discuss that film. The final Sunday in May on the 28th, Brian is hosting The Grey, the Joe Carnahan film, the Liam Neeson's versus Wolves in the Arctic. That's going to be at 5 p.m. on that Sunday, the 28th. We're having a little contest, so whomever shows up with the dopest wolf t-shirt, sweater, whatever garment you choose will win a $20 Alamo Drafthouse gift card. So come participate and be on the lookout for that. That's going to do it for us. Check out our Fistful of Aliens Fistful episode coming up on Friday in honor of the release of Alien Covenant. We hope you enjoy this episode. We hope you enjoy the series. We hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you all for listening. And until next time.